Okay, welcome to the research desk. Consider the atmosphere of a high-end fine art auction.
Okay.
It is a space built entirely on historical continuity, pedigree, and really the mythos of the human hand. For centuries, the rituals of places like Christie's or, Sotheby's have been predicated on the direct physical connection between a recognized genius and the physical artifact left behind.
Right, the brushstroke as a kind of forensic record of human passion.
Exactly, a forensic record. Now, transport yourself to October 2018, inside Christie's auction house in New York. The room is expectant, the gavel is ready, but the lot on the block defies every single traditional metric of artistic valuation. We must ask ourselves, what happens when an algorithm enters a centuries-old fine art auction?
I remember this. The piece in question is titled Portrait of Edmond de Belamy, right?
Yes, Edmond de Belamy. And if you were to look at it, you would see this slightly blurred, classical-looking portrait of a gentleman in a dark coat with a stark white collar. It looks like a painting you might find in a dusty wing of the Louvre, perhaps an unfinished canvas from the 18th century.
A bit smudged, but yeah.
Right. The pre-auction estimates placed its value exactly where you might expect a minor, unproven curiosity to sit, somewhere between $7,000 and $10,000.
Which is pocket change for Christie's.
Absolute pocket change. But by the time the bidding concluded, in a room full of seasoned collectors and art historians, that piece sold for $432,500.
Yeah, and the mechanical reality behind that staggering number is where the actual narrative resides, I think. We really need to demystify exactly what was sold that day, because that image was not painted.
No.
There was no brush, no palette, and no 18th century gentleman. It was generated by a Paris-based collective known as Obvious. And to understand what they did, we have to look under the hood at the specific technology they utilized, which is called a generative adversarial network, or, a GAN.
And a GAN is structurally fascinating.
It is. And for the listener, it is crucial to understand how a GAN operates, because it goes directly to the question of who or what the artist actually is. So a GAN consists of two separate neural networks locked in this perpetual game of cat and mouse.
Right. The generator and the discriminator.
Exactly. You have the generator, which acts like a master art forger. Its entire job is to create synthetic images. Then you have the discriminator, which acts like an art detective. Its job is to look at the forgery, compare it to a training data set, and guess whether the image is real or fake.
And in the case of Edmond de Belamy, the data set was massive, wasn't it?
Yeah. It consisted of 15,000 historical portraits from the 14th to the 20th century. So the generator makes an image. The discriminator flags it as fake, and the generator learns from that rejection to make a slightly better fake the next time. They loop millions of times until the discriminator can no longer tell the difference between a pixel arrangement made by the algorithm and a digital photograph of an actual Renaissance painting.
That's a brilliant mechanism.
It is brilliant. But here's the critical detail. Obvious, the collective that actually printed and sold this image, they did not write the core algorithm.
Wait, really? They just used someone else's code?
Yes. The underlying code for this model was originally built by an entirely different individual, a young programmer named Robbie Barrett, who had open-sourced his code on GitHub. And perhaps the most telling detail of the entire spectacle was the signature in the bottom right corner of the canvas.
Oh, the mathematical formula.
Right. It was not signed with Robbie Barrett's name. It was not signed with the names of the members of Obvious. It was signed with a mathematical equation. Specifically, it was signed with the loss function formula of the algorithm itself.
Which is incredible.
Well, it's provocative. The loss function is the mathematical mechanism the algorithm uses to calculate how far off its generated image is from a real painting. By placing that formula where the human signature normally goes, they were making a massive philosophical declaration.
And that signature is the perfect emblem for our central tension today. By replacing the human name with the mathematical mechanism of learning, they are
they're forcing us to look at a profound evolution in how we define creativity.
I disagree, but go on.
Well, I will argue that this represents a fundamental shift, where system design itself carries legitimate, recognizable artistic intention. We are witnessing the relocation of agency.
The relocation of agency?
Yes. For thousands of years, the definition of a visual artist was inextricably linked to motor skills. You had to have the physical dexterity to manipulate pigment on a surface. But what Portrait of Edmond de Belamy signals is that you no longer need to hold the brush to be the artist.
Okay, but
Designing the architecture that holds the brush, establishing the parameters of the mathematical space, and defining the rules by which a system learns, these are equally profound creative acts. We are moving from the artist as an executor to the artist as an architect.
And I will argue that we are completely mistaking algorithmic output for artistic meaning. What we are seeing in these generative outputs is a combination of pattern recognition and, quite frankly, cultural framing masquerading as intention.
Masquerading. That's a strong word.
It is, because we look at the blurred edges of the Belamy portrait and we project human emotion onto it. We think, the machine is capturing the fleeting nature of memory, or the algorithm is commenting on the decay of classical forms.
Which is exactly what art critics have always done with human art.
But the machine is doing no such thing. It is simply failing to perfectly align the pixels according to its statistical map. A non-representational pattern generated by a machine is not the same thing as artistic abstraction. Generation, no matter how complex the mathematics behind it, is not expression.
I think you're getting hung up on the physical act of creation.
I'm getting hung up on consciousness. We're conflating an incredibly sophisticated parlor trick of statistical mimicry with the lived, conscious act of making art.
Let us examine the requirement of the human hand, because history shows us that hand skill has never been the sole prerequisite for art, and we continually relocate artistic agency as technology evolves. We have literally been through this exact existential crisis before.
You're going to bring up the camera, aren't you?
I am, because it's the perfect analogy. Consider the camera. When photography first emerged in the 19th century, it faced the exact same accusations of sterility that generative code faces today. Critics, including prominent thinkers like Charles Baudelaire, argued that a camera merely captures photons.
Right, a mechanical recording device.
Exactly. It was viewed as an industrial tool for documentation, entirely devoid of the human soul required for fine art. Painters argued that because the machine did the work of rendering the perspective and the light, the person pushing the button was just an operator, not an artist.
Okay, but photography involves physical choices in the real world.
So does code. Photography became a profoundly respected art form because we realized that the art was not in the rendering of the light. The art was in the framing, the exposure, the timing, the selection of the subject, and the chemical mastery of the darkroom. The machine did not disqualify the art, it simply shifted where the artist applied their intention.
I see the parallel you're trying to draw, but
Code extends this exact logic. The code is not a brush, it is a score. If I am a digital artist listening to this and I spend 3 months tuning parameters, defining mathematical weights, and carefully curating the environment in which an algorithm operates, I am deeply invested in the final outcome.
But you don't control the outcome.
Why do we demand direct physical execution from digital artists when we have never demanded that a composer personally play every instrument in the symphony? Think about it. The composer writes the sheet music, the orchestra executes it. The coder writes the algorithm, the machine executes it. The locus of the art is in the composition.
Okay. The composer analogy is a lazy shortcut in modern discourse, and we really need to dismantle it carefully.
Lazy? How so?
When a composer writes a symphony, they know exactly what note the oboe will play in the third measure. They have an explicit deterministic intent for the auditory output. When someone trains a GAN on 15,000 images, they have no idea what the specific output will be. They are setting a process in motion and harvesting the results.
But they designed the possibility space of those results.
Harvesting is not composing, but I want to go deeper into your claim about abstraction and dismantle the idea that non-representational form equates to abstraction. Abstraction in art has historically meant more than just the absence of a recognizable figure or a blurred edge.
Of course it has. It's a formal exploration.
Right. Let us look at Pete Mondrian or Wassily Kandinsky. When Mondrian paints his famous grid of red, yellow, and blue, he didn't just throw geometry at a canvas. He spent years painting highly detailed representational trees and slowly, deliberately, over a decade, stripped away the bark, the leaves, and the branches until only the essential vertical and horizontal tensions remained.
Yes, the progression of his tree series is legendary.
Exactly. Abstraction requires reduction, distillation, and most importantly, conscious choice. A spreadsheet can arrange millions of numbers into an elegant, non-representational visual grid. A corrupted digital file can glitch and generate fascinating, unpredictable color fields that look incredibly striking.
Which we sometimes call glitch art.
But neither of these is abstract art simply because they lack a recognizable subject. True abstraction requires a human consciousness deciding what to leave out, what to emphasize, and why. The algorithm merely executes a mathematical optimization. It possesses no lived relation to the subject it is reducing.
It's mapping statistical relationships.
But it does not know what a face is, so it cannot abstract a face. It does not know what it has omitted, and therefore it cannot abstract. It can only generate variations of noise.
Well, we must look at the historical precedent for delegating execution, which proves that the instruction set itself can be the locus of genius, even when the final output contains elements of chance or variation. You bring up the necessity of direct manipulation, but the conceptual art movement solved this debate half a century ago.
You mean the conceptualists?
Yes. Consider the artist LeWitt. In 1970, he created a piece called Wall Drawing 17. But the work itself is not a physical object that he built or painted. It is a set of instructions.
Right. The museum buys the instructions.
Exactly. The instructions read exactly like this. 4-part drawing. In a 12-inch square, 4 equal squares with a different line direction in each. That is the artwork. LeWitt delegated the execution entirely to draftspeople. If a museum acquires a LeWitt wall drawing today, they do not buy a piece of drywall. They buy a certificate of authenticity and the instruction set, and their own staff draws it on the wall.
I know the woods work well, but it's fundamentally different from a neural network.
How? LeWitt proved decades ago that the concept and the instruction set became the art, regardless of whose hand actually held the graphite. Generative algorithms are simply infinitely more complex LeWitt instructions. The artist's intent lives purely in the rules they author.
That's a stretch.
It's not. Furthermore, this computational lineage goes back even further, long before the AI hype of today. In 1968, the Hungarian-born artist Vera Molnar was working with early, room-sized mainframe computers. We are talking about an era of punch cards and mechanical plotters.
True. The mainframe era.
She wrote programs to introduce what she called 1% disorder into geometric grids. She used computational variation to probe visual order. Her achievement was not the mere novelty that a machine drew a picture. Her art was the deliberate use of computation to formalize aesthetic questions about order, disruption, and rhythm. She didn't paint the squares, the plotter did, but she authored the system. She designed the constraints.
I accept that history, and Vera Molnar is undeniably a pioneer. But I vehemently reject the equivalence you were drawing between her deliberate, mathematical explorations and modern algorithmic output like Belamy. Let us use the analogy of the Japanese potter to understand why the physical execution still matters profoundly.
All right, lay it out.
A master potter in the Japanese tradition spends decades cultivating an embodied relationship with clay, heat, the moisture in the air, and the inevitability of imperfection. Every slight pressure of the thumb, every subtle shift in the kiln's temperature carries the weight of a lived human life.
Okay.
Now, suppose we program a highly advanced robotic arm to perfectly replicate the exact firing schedule, the exact physical motions, and the exact glaze application of that master potter. The robot produces a pot. If you place them side by side on a table, visually, the robot's pot and the human's pot are identical. You cannot tell them apart.
Visually identical, yes.
But the human pot contains a condensed human process. The meaning of the art is intrinsically tied to the consciousness navigating the material resistance of the physical world. The robot faced no resistance. It only executed a loop.
But
Let me offer another analogy that directly addresses your point about system design. Designing a saw is a remarkable feat of engineering. The person who invented the modern circular saw changed the world.
Sure.
But designing a saw does not make every piece of wood you cut with it a sculpture. Designing an algorithm is a brilliant technical achievement. Robbie Barrett's code is elegant and mathematically beautiful. But it does not make every output that algorithm spits out a work of art. The tool is not the artwork, and the output of the tool is not automatically significant just because the tool is complex.
I hear the potter analogy, but isn't that just romanticizing physical labor? Why is sweat, or the resistance of clay, a prerequisite for artistic meaning? Let me challenge your saw analogy, because it fundamentally misrepresents what an algorithm is.
How so?
An algorithm is not a saw. A saw is a dumb tool. It only cuts in a straight line based on the immediate physical force you apply to it. An algorithm, particularly a generative one, is more like a genetically engineered seed.
A seed.
Yes, you design the DNA, you establish the parameters of how it will react to its environment, you plant it, and it grows into a unique tree every single time. You don't know exactly where every branch will go, but the architecture of the tree, its overarching aesthetic, its nature, is entirely dictated by your design. The design of the seed is the art.
But a seed is a biological imperative, not a cultural artifact.
And what if the artist is explicitly treating the algorithm itself as their medium? Look at Reas and the creation of the processing programming language in the early 2000s. Processing did not just lower the barrier for coding, it gave artists a dedicated language to treat code as a medium of formal inquiry.
Processing is very different from Midjourney.
With processing, you are writing parametric rules. If this pixel does this, then that shape moves there. The constraints, the variation ranges, the formal tensions, these are all meticulously designed by the artist. Think of it like a financial model. We know that quantitative systems in finance or public policy are never neutral.
Absolutely, they're heavily biased.
Right, they always encode the assumptions, values, biases, and blind spots of their designers. If we accept that mathematical systems inherently embody human assumptions, then we must logically accept that generative systems encode artistic intention. The artist's agency is simply displaced upward. Instead of manipulating the pigment, they're manipulating the logic. They're engaging in meta-creation.
You are making a fatal conceptual mistake by lumping Reas's processing together with large AI diffusion models. And this is where we really have to get highly technical. We must stress test your bull case by completely disentangling rule-based code from statistical AI.
I don't think they're as fundamentally opposed as you claim.
They are mechanically entirely distinct. In a Reas system, as you rightly pointed out, the artist authors the behavior directly. It is procedural. The artist writes, draw a circle here, make it this large, loop it this many times. The code is explicit.
Yes.
But in modern AI image generation, the Midjourneys, the Stable Diffusions, the systems that are dominating the conversation today, the mechanism is entirely different. These are diffusion models. They work by taking an image, gradually adding statistical noise to it until it is pure static, and then training a neural network to reverse that process, to denoise the static back into an image based on text prompts.
The latent space.
Exactly. And the system's capacity relies on the statistical compression of enormous data sets scraped indiscriminately from the internet. The person typing the prompt did not write the rules of proportion, color theory, or composition. They are just steering a statistical probability engine.
The navigating the latent space.
This creates what I can only describe as a bulimia of images. We have systems now producing 60 to 100 highly rendered variations per hour at a microscopic marginal cost. There is zero friction. And here is the core truth. More production is not more art. It causes abundance without orientation.
Well, curation.
When you generate 100 images of a cyberpunk city before lunch, the images lose their meaning. We are aestheticizing a hidden infrastructure. When you look at an AI-generated image, you are not looking at the isolated genius of a system designer. You are looking at scraped images, underpaid data annotation workers categorizing those images, and massive structural bias embedded in the dataset. What you are calling high-level abstract art might just be derivative human culture regurgitated at an industrial scale.
Look, I acknowledge the mechanical distinction between rule-based procedural generation and statistical diffusion models. It is a vital technical point. But the market, the collectors, and the evolution of the digital art space suggest my thesis holds true across these paradigms, precisely because the curation of the output becomes the new locus of intention.
Curation is not creation.
Let us look past the initial shock of Edmond de Belamy from 2018. That was the primitive era of this technology. Let us examine the evolution of the generative art market, specifically the work of Tyler Hobbs, who operates in that procedural, rule-based space you actually respect.
Hobbs is a different tier, yes.
Hobbs created a generative series called Fidenza. For the listener, a Fidenza output looks like an incredibly complex, organic, abstract painting, sweeping curves, vibrant colors, structured yet chaotic. It is powered by flow fields, a mathematical algorithm that guides visual elements across the canvas smoothly.
He spent a lot of time on that algorithm.
He spent months refining the algorithm, adjusting the probabilities of certain color palettes, the density of the lines, and the likelihood of negative space. He then locked the algorithm on the blockchain, and it generated 999 unique outputs. A single generative NFT from this collection sold for $8 million.
$8 million?
This represents a profound maturation in our understanding of value. The market evolved from buying a gimmick, the novelty of a machine making a painting, which is what Belamy was, to genuinely valuing an authored system of variation. Originality today has been redefined. It no longer strictly means crafting one singular, perfect object.
So what does it mean?
Originality means designing a bounded field of variation that is rich enough, coherent enough, and intentional enough to sustain deep interpretation across hundreds of outputs. It is not an infinite vending machine of novelty, spitting out random cyberpunk cities. It is a curated possibility space. The artist builds a world, and the outputs are just snapshots of that world.
I read that market reality entirely differently. Let us perform a post-mortem on that $432,000 Christie sale of Edmond de Belamy. You frame it as the primitive beginning. I frame it as the original sin of the generative art market.
Original sin?
That event is actually a cautionary tale, not a validation of a new artistic paradigm. The Christie sale did not prove that a machine was an artist. It proved that legacy institutions possess the immense power to turn mechanical output into high art, simply by building a compelling narrative around it. The discourse was the art.
The context always matters in art.
But the auction house, the collective obvious, the mathematical signature, they manufactured a media spectacle. They played on the public's misunderstanding of artificial intelligence. The market vastly overpaid for that spectacle, not for the aesthetic value of the blurred portrait.
The market decides value.
Stripped of the Christie's framing, stripped of the gold frame and the velvet room, that image is just a file sitting in a folder among thousands of other rejected variations that the discriminator network spat out. And the exact same critique applies to the later boom in generative art. The danger of your possibility space is that the audience is seduced by the sheer volume of variations, attributing profound architectural intent to what is often just statistical noise, curated after the fact.
But the curation is the intent.
If a machine gives you 10,000 images and you pick the 3 that happen to look like profound abstract expressionism, you are not a genius architect. You are a lottery winner who bought all the tickets. We are allowing the curation of accidents to be elevated to the level of intentional design.
Well, it seems we are approaching a shared analytical framework, even if we weigh the elements of that framework differently. What this rigorous examination reveals is that the foundational question that dominated the discourse back in 2018, did the machine make the art, is fundamentally the wrong question to ask.
Agreed. It's too simplistic.
It relies on a false dichotomy. Digital abstraction, whether it is procedural, like Vera Molnar and Tyler Hobbs, or statistical, like a diffusion model, cannot be judged by the binary of human versus machine. It must be evaluated as a complex, interconnected human-machine system.
A hybrid.
Yes. To judge these works properly, we require what we might call a visible authorship stack. When a critic or a collector looks at a piece of generative art, they should not just look at the final pixels. We need to critically evaluate the coder who wrote the base architecture, the model designer who fine-tuned the parameters, the source and composition of the dataset, and ultimately the curator who selected the final output from the possibility space. Every layer of that stack contains human choices.
And we are in agreement on the necessity of that framework. The idea of the solitary genius standing before a blank canvas is entirely dead in this medium. We can no longer evaluate a piece without understanding the provenance of its data, the encoded biases of its algorithmic structure, and the institutional forces framing its presentation.
Exactly.
If we fail to map that authorship stack explicitly, we abdicate our responsibility as critics and observers of culture. We surrender our critical faculties to the black box of the algorithm, accepting whatever it outputs as inevitable or profound, rather than as the direct result of upstream human engineering and economic incentives.
The through line is not that machines replaced artists. It is that artists learned to author systems instead of surfaces.
If originality increasingly means designing a compelling possibility space, how do we train our eyes to judge the architecture of a system rather than just being seduced by the infinite variations it spits out? This is the Research Desk, officially signing off.